Hey, so 2 years ago I came up with a name for a popular or not that popular design style called Neumorphism, and even in that very first article I wrote that Neumorphism is not without problems, so it is a fresh new approach to some of the design patterns, but it's not really perfect in every regard. And of course many designers, especially those non-visual ones, started crying right away that it's horribly non-accessible and you should never use it. No, don't use it! But because I don't really believe in people telling me what not to do, instead I want to actually create a little tutorial in which I'm gonna play around with this style, but I'm gonna keep it accessible and I'm gonna explain it to you why this is accessible and why it's not necessarily the best idea. I believe that as designers, and especially in UI, we need to explore new ideas and new concepts all the time, so even if a style is not particularly great, it's really good to actually play around with it and check it for yourself, because you might be able to use it in some other different layout or mix it with something. So if we weren't exploring, we would all end up with apps looking like material design, and that would be a horrible world to live in. No! Okay, to have a solid base from which we're gonna start building our new neumorphic design, I'm gonna use the glassmorphing tutorial that I created a little while ago, and I'm gonna link this in the description as well. So it's really good that if you do that tutorial first and then do this one. So I'm gonna start by creating a new artboard, and it's gonna be some iPhone, it doesn't really matter. I picked the background color from some other neumorphic shot that I found particularly good, so it's just gonna make it simpler for me. So then I'm gonna go into the fill for our new frame and just pick it off that color, but it doesn't have to be that way. So just to show you, as long as you keep it in the range of a pretty bright color here, of course it can work with dark mode as well, but like we're gonna do a bright one first. It doesn't matter if you modify the hue, so you can go with any different color, and just to illustrate it, I'm gonna go with like a more pink hue as well, and I'm gonna create an option like that to just show you how it works. But we're gonna use the blue one. Okay, time to create the first object. So using the rectangle tool, I'm gonna create a card, because we're gonna basically recreate that glassmorphic screen on the left into a neumorphic one on the right. So I want the card to be 32 points from every side. That will make those shadows more visible. Okay, once the card is ready, I'm gonna round the corners and I'm gonna keep it at 32 as well. Generally, neumorphism works really well if the corners are rounded. If they're really sharp, it won't work. And for the background, I'm gonna pick the same background that we already have, and obviously the shape is gonna disappear. So let's add a shadow. And we're gonna have two shadows here, a dark one that's gonna be going towards the bottom right, and then a light one that's gonna go towards the top left. So I'm gonna set the X and Y value at 8, and then the blur is gonna be 16, and I'm gonna pick a very light blue for this shadow, because that way you won't really have to play around with the opacity as much, and you can actually tweak it so it blends in with the background but make it still visible. So I'm tweaking the blur value as well. I'm gonna go with 32 because I want that very soft look on the card. But obviously we need one more shadow, or highlight actually. So I'm gonna add another effect, another shadow, but this time the values are gonna be negative. So I'm gonna go with -8 for the X and -8 for the Y. Blur is gonna be 32 again, but this time for the color we're gonna pick pure white. So just move that slider onto the top left of the window. And if your background is pretty light and the effect is not that visible, you can increase the blur or increase the actual opacity so it's not as transparent. Just play around until it's still subtle. So we don't really want either of the shadows to overtake the other one. So the dark one needs to be almost as strong as the light one. And of course you can change those values at any time, so don't be too attached to them, just play around with something that works now, but once you add the photos and the text, it might actually happen that it won't really work. So okay, let's duplicate this very quickly, and I'm gonna switch the colors. I'm just gonna use the color picker to pick the pink that we created, and I'm gonna use the same thing for the background, but of course we can't have a blue shadow here, so I'm just gonna drag the hue slider towards the pink a little bit. Let's just move this out of the way so it's visible. Okay, yeah, and since the white one was just pure white, it's gonna be fine here with the other color. And as you can see, that's a very easy way to create this effect with any color. But we're gonna go with the blue one for this entire tutorial. Okay, I already had the photo in there, so I'm just gonna go into the glassmorphic screen and then just copy the photo, including that shadow that it had, and I'm gonna paste it onto this new screen. And if that shadow is barely visible or doesn't really fit the background, it's really good to actually convert it to a similar color so I can recreate it again. And I'm gonna pick a color from the actual shadow of the card and then blur this entire thing a little bit. So I'm just gonna add layer blur to it, and the blur can be a little bit bigger, but it's good to actually move this object in place before you blur it so you can see it. And of course the photo itself can have a drop shadow as well, so you don't really have to use that blurred oval technique, but I like it because it gives me more flexibility on how the shadow looks like. So yeah, I really like this style and I'm gonna keep it, just gonna enlarge this a little bit, and I tweaked the color just a tiny bit so it's more visible. Okay, now I'm gonna quickly copy and paste the text from the other one, and of course it's not gonna be white because it's not gonna be visible on that background. So if you're gonna go with Neumorphism in dark mode, you can keep the text white, but for here I'm gonna pick a very dark gray with a little bit of blue in it just to match the background. So I'm just gonna pick it off the background and decrease the brightness. Okay, now I'm gonna select the other text, and this is basically like a meta information box, so I'm just gonna select it and paste it onto the screen. And of course it can't be white either, so I'm just gonna modify the color very quickly. And for the glassmorphic screen, we had a darker background there that actually made a little bit of that frosted glass appear darker, and it was a pretty cool effect. But for this one, we need to create an indented neumorphic style thing. So obviously, I'm gonna just create a rectangle in the background, and I'm gonna set a smaller corner radius than the main card. It's really important. So I'm gonna go with 8 even. And then for that, we're gonna change the background color using the color picker to that same background again. And of course this shape has to disappear, but what you can also do, since it's indented, you can actually change that background color to a tiny bit darker one, but just a little bit, like 1 or 2 points. Okay, now let's add some inner shadows, but they'll have to be opposite now. So the darker one will have to be on the top left and then the lighter one on the bottom right. So for this example, I'm gonna go with 4 as the X and Y value and then -4 for the other shadow. And of course, yes, we need 2 inner shadows, and you can pick that exactly same background color for the blur and for that shadow. So you can pick the color of the shadow that you already have on the card. And now simply play around with the opacity until it looks right. Okay, adding that second shadow, the lighter one with negative values, so -4 for X and Y, and a little bit of blur. And of course it has to be white for this highlight effect to work on the indentation. And then after this, I'm gonna create the effect that we used many times before, which is creating 2 rectangles that are exactly half the width of our main rectangle, and then aligning them one next to each other, and then aligning the text within the centers of those rectangles. That will basically make the text, or those 2 text objects, completely proportionally spaced within the rectangle, because right now they're a little bit too much to the sides. And once the horizontal position is right, you can tweak the vertical one as well. So you can give them a little bit more vertical white space. And I'm actually gonna add a little bit more space because just to spice things up a little bit, and because this screen is actually pretty boring visually, I'm gonna add some emojis on top of those numbers just to make it a little bit more colorful. And that's one thing with neumorphism that I believe is important. If you just keep it to those neumorphic elements and some text objects, it's gonna look bland and boring. So try to always tweak it into something a little bit more interesting. One thing that I also created here is 2 vertical lines, one completely white and one a little bit darker than the background, to create this little indented line effect. And of course you don't really have to do that, but just in case, I'm gonna group this and completely horizontally center it. Okay, now let's add a little bit more space at the bottom, and let's add the button, the follow button. But at first I'm gonna do it the wrong way. And that wrong way is basically the path that most designers took while exploring neumorphism. This may be the reason for so much negative comments on that style, because people just overused the effect. So I'm just gonna keep all the distances at 24, so 24 from the left, from the right, and from the bottom. And once this works, I'm just gonna simply select the card that we have in the background already, then copy the style out of that card and then paste it onto our button. So pretty simple, right? Copy the layer style or the properties and then simply select the rectangle that you just created and paste it. And yeah, It's a very neumorphic style button, and obviously it's pretty non-accessible because it's barely visible. And that's the whole point. And first of all, I'm gonna modify the corner radius to actually match the corner radius of the card. This is pretty important, but that didn't solve the problem. This button is barely visible and this entire card looks bland, boring, and uninteresting. The main important rule of any design style, whether it's neumorphism, glassmorphism, material design, or anything, is that you keep all the important UI elements accessible. So things like buttons, form fields, the main text, and everything else. And what you can actually play around with is the decoration, which are the card backgrounds or some additional background elements. And of course, if you just add a very dark button here, which is gonna be like a text link, it could still work even with the button being not visible, but it's the bad approach. So let's make a good one first. So I'm gonna go back into our glassmorphism card and I'm gonna copy the properties of that button and I'm gonna paste it onto this one. And that one change instantly makes this whole design look a lot better because this fixes the main problem. The main UI element here is completely accessible. And of course I made some additional inner shadows on it to make some indentations a little bit, but this actually could work with Neumorphism because it's basically the opposite of that effect but with colors. So that can still match it and still can look pretty good. But if you want to learn that particular effect, it's in the other tutorial on the glassmorphism style. And for the decoration here, I'm gonna go pretty unoriginal and I'm also add those little balls that we had in the glassmorphism tutorial because it's an easy way to actually make the screen look interesting. But I'm gonna pick the colors out of the colors that we have on this screen, obviously. This is the exact same pattern that we did in the glassmorphism tutorial, so if you don't know how to do these elements and how to make nice shadows for them, watch that tutorial again and it should help you. And of course, as I said, you can decrease the brightness of that indented part a little bit, but what you can also do is add a little stroke to it. So just a tiny bit of stroke, but of course not a black one. You can go with like an inside or outside stroke. I'm gonna go with center just to see how it looks like, and I'm gonna select white. And if you go with center and you make it a little bit transparent, it actually can create a pretty nice effect of part of that border being shaded with the shadow inside and part of it being outside. But it really depends on what you're looking for. Okay, just to make this new design a little bit different, I'm also gonna modify the colors of the buttons, so I want it a little bit more blue. And as you can see, I added that little border around the main card as well. It's not completely necessary to add it, but it can look a little bit better with it. Okay, making that quick change to the button, which basically means selecting both ends of the gradient and then moving the hue slider. So I'm not gonna modify any of the other values, just the hue first, and I want to see how they look like, and then I can tweak it a little bit. Okay, now let's talk accessibility, because obviously the card itself and that indented card in the background there as well are not visible for people that have some vision problems or people that have lower quality displays in their phones. So how does this work? Is this accessible or not? And really that depends on the context. Because by accessible, we mean that there is nothing interfering with the usage of this. So people will be able to still use this product and they're not gonna be impaired in any way and they'll be able to understand it completely. So let's make an experiment here. I'm gonna duplicate the screen and then keeping the content, I'm gonna remove the background of the card. So there's no Neumorphism on this screen at all anymore. And as you can see, you can still understand that this is one item, this is one card. But there is one caveat, because this hierarchy doesn't really work that great with this distance being that big. So that's like the one major issue here. So it does work, but a better version of it will actually be bringing everything a little bit closer together so the user can clearly see that these things are connected, they're part of one group. So anything can be accessible if all the important elements are accessible and if the hierarchy and the structure and the layout of it is good. So even without the background, you know what will happen if you press the follow button, because obviously it's gonna follow the person that's right above it. Okay, and to wrap things up, I'm gonna create a version of this whole mockup that we created in that very first tutorial. And once again, if you haven't checked it already, go there first and then do this one because it's gonna make a lot more sense. So I'm just gonna quickly modify it to have a nicer presentation of it. One thing with the mockups though is that if you're gonna go with Neumorphism, avoid adding that neumorphic effect to the phone mockup and avoid adding that color to the background. It has to stand out a little bit. So a couple quick fixes and tweaks and we're done with the mockup. pasting and copying different styles that we already have, but as you can see, if I create that phone mockup in the background to be white instead of being that same color as the entire neumorphic card, it's gonna look way better. Effects work well when they're not overused. Just keeping it safe and simple every time is not gonna be worth it in the long run, because it's just gonna get boring. We don't really want boring design, do we? Of course not.